The plateau was frozen long before winter came. The thin ice crust that covered it stretched for kilometers, glittering under a pale, washed-out sky. But the glitter held no warmth, no life, no whisper of wind. It lay still as polished stone, flat and unmoving, catching the faint light like an abandoned mirror. A lynx named Kale padded across the surface with careful, deliberate steps. His paws usually sank slightly into snow or left faint prints in thin frost. But now the plateau gave him no track to follow, no crumble, no indentation, nothing. The frost didn't break. Kale lifted a paw, watching for the familiar mark his claws might carve. Nothing. It was like stepping on glass. He twitched his tufted ears, listening. But there was nothing to hear. Mountains always carried sound, wind scraping cliffs, ice cracking in slow, deep groans, ravens calling across the peaks, low murmurs of distant avalanches rolling like muted thunder. Hunters and prey alike were part of the mountain's breathing. But here, even Kale's breathing sounded muffled, as though the air swallowed the sound before it reached his own ears. He tested his voice. A soft growl pushed past his throat. It vanished the moment it left his mouth, dissolving into the frozen air without echo, without carry, without life. Kale lowered his head. Something was very wrong. He walked farther onto the plateau. The frost shimmered faintly, reflecting an almost colourless sky. But beneath the thin mirrored surface, the ground looked dark, as though the frost was merely a thin veil stretched over something hollow. Kale's thick winter fur bristled. He scanned the land. Nothing moved. Not the distant pines. Not the scattered boulders. Not even the thin clouds that should have drifted lazily overhead. They stayed suspended, stretched across the sky like a painting pinned in place. He sniffed the air. Cold. Still. Unnatural. And faintly metallic, as if the plateau exhaled iron. Kyle moved toward a jagged rock formation jutting out from the center. Frost coated the stone in thin lace patterns. The patterns were too perfect, sharp, geometric, etched like carvings rather than natural frost. He placed a paw on the rock. It was warm. Kyle jerked back instantly. The stone shouldn't be warm. Not here. Not after weeks of sub-zero cold. He circled the rock warily. Thin cracks radiated outward from it like the veins of frost spiderwebbing on a frozen lake, except the cracks were glowing faintly from beneath. A weak blue-white shimmer leaked through the frost, like light trapped below the surface of the earth. Kale flattened his ears. The plateau wasn't frozen, it was sealed. He stepped away from the rock, and the air vibrated slightly, an almost inaudible hum that made his whiskers twitch. Then he saw movement. Far at the edge of the plateau, a line of bright orange vests appeared. Humans. They moved around a cluster of equipment. Tall metal frames, cylinders with lights, cables trailing across the frozen ground. Their boots struck the frost, but Kyle heard nothing. Silence swallowed their footsteps completely. Kyle crouched low, watching. A woman tapped a screen fixed to a metal stand. The screen flickered, showing jagged green lines. Another human unwound a cable and fed it into a device anchored into the ground by long metal spikes. A third stood near a large rectangular box that hummed with low mechanical vibration. Kale felt that vibration through his paws. Their machine was the source. The frost cracked faintly beneath the device, but no sound came, only the visual fracture. One human shouted toward the others. Kale saw her mouth move clearly, but he heard nothing. Not a whisper, not even a distant muffled noise. The plateau absorbed all sound. The humans exchanged nervous glances. One stepped back from the machine, scanning the frost. Another tapped a gauge that spun erratically. A man pointed at Kale's side of the plateau, shouting again, but no sound reached him. Then something shifted below. Kale felt it, not through his ears, but through the frost. A deep tremor rolled under his paws, slow and heavy, like a massive creature stirring far beneath the earth. The frost rippled outward in tiny concentric waves. The cracks near the glowing rock deepened, brightening slightly. Cale jumped back. The plateau pulsed, not violently, not yet, but enough that the frost lifted and fell like the skin of a breathing beast. The humans noticed. One stumbled. Another dropped a tool. A third stared wide-eyed at a circular fissure forming around the glowing rock. Cale felt heat rising through the cracks. Heat under a frozen plateau. He backed up until his paws reached thicker crust, but the plateau pulsed again, a long, slow shudder that passed through the world like a breath from something buried alive. Then the silence changed. Cale realized it was not silence at all. It was suction. The air wasn't still, it was being pulled downward into the plateau. Every sound, every vibration, every breath was absorbed. The plateau wasn't quiet. It was feeding. Cale spun and ran. His paws skidded on the glassy frost, but instinct carried him forward. He raced toward the ridge, claws scraping uselessly for traction. Behind him, the glowing cracks widened. The rock formation shifted. Frost shattered in sharp, silent shards. The humans panicked. One pointed frantically at the glowing fissures. Another sprinted to the machine. A third grabbed his companion's arm, yanking him toward the trucks parked beyond the crest. But Cale didn't watch long enough to see what happened to them. He was almost at the edge when the plateau inhaled. A violent downward pull sucked cold air into the cracks. Snow dust spiraled inward, forming a whirlpool of frost. Cale felt the suction drag at his fur, pulling him backward. He leapt toward the ridge. His claws finally found rough stone, traction. He climbed rapidly, muscles burning, lungs tight. He reached the top of the ridge and looked back. The plateau below him was sinking, not collapsing, sinking in a slow, impossible motion, like a massive sheet of ice sliding downward into a hidden void. The glowing cracks widened until the entire center of the plateau glowed faintly from beneath. Silence thickened. Not a single sound escaped the sinking ice. Cale stared, breath misting in the cold air. The plateau wasn't breaking, it was opening, and whatever lay beneath had been waiting for a very long time. Cale stayed at the edge of the ridge, muscles tight, fur bristling against the cold as he watched the frosted plateau sink by slow degrees. The motion was agonizingly smooth, unnatural, silent, like a gigantic slab of ice descending into an elevator shaft no one had known existed. The silence deepened further. It pressed around him, not as absence, but as weight, pushing against his ears, crawling down his throat. Cale flexed his jaws instinctively, trying to relieve the pressure. His breath came out as thin steam, but even that disappeared too quickly, pulled downward toward the plateau. Silence was not passive anymore. It was exerting force. Cale dug his claws into the stone ridge. Below, the humans finally grasped the danger. One woman stumbled backward from her machine, her face pale beneath her hood. She waved both arms frantically toward her team, signaling retreat. Her voice, whatever she screamed, never reached Cale. The plateau swallowed her sound too. Her colleagues scrambled toward the trucks stationed beyond the flat expanse. Their boots struck the frost, but Cale heard nothing. No crunch, no thud, only the visual of frantic motion. A man tried to yank free a thick cable embedded in the frost. He pulled once, twice, then gave up, letting it trail behind him as he fled. Another shoveled snow and frost away from the base of a tall scanning mast, revealing glowing cracks spreading beneath its foundation. He looked up too late. A pulse rolled under the ground, a deeper one, unmistakable, a tremor from something enormous shifting far below. The mast tilted, hesitated, then dropped silently into a widening fissure. 1 second it stood tall, the next it vanished into the glowing underlayer without a trace. No crash, no echo, no sound of impact, just disappearance. Cale felt his heart slam in his chest. The humans now abandoned their work completely. They grabbed equipment at random, cases, screens, cables, and ran toward their vehicles. One truck revved its engine, but even that produced no audible roar. Its wheels kicked snow and gravel in concentric rings that drifted downward instead of outward. The silence bent everything toward the sinking plateau. Kyle watched with widening eyes. He wasn't alone on the ridge anymore. A pair of mountain hares bolted from between two pine bushes, leaping in high arcs. Their landings produced no sound. Their noses twitched furiously, whiskers trembling at the unnatural pull from the plateau. A wolverine lumbered toward higher ground too, its dark fur bristling. It growled once. Kale saw its throat vibrate, but not a whisper escaped its jaws. It glared back at the plateau as if challenging a rival predator. But the plateau did not answer. It only sank deeper. Kyle watched the glowing fissures widen further. Blue-white light pulsed beneath the frost like a heartbeat. Slow, steady, ancient. The cracks spread outward, crawling across the surface in delicate patterns another creature might have mistaken for veins of ice. But Kale saw something else in them. Movement. Not quick, not fluid, but pulsating, like pressure shifting through tight passages beneath the surface. The fissures brightened briefly, then dimmed, then brightened again in a rhythm too slow to belong to machinery. This was not human-made. The humans clearly understood that too. One of them pointed at a handheld detector whose lights flared bright red across its screen. The operator shook his head in disbelief. Another scrambled into a snowmobile, slamming the door shut, face drenched with sweat despite the cold. But before he could reverse, the ground beneath the snowmobile shivered. A thin fracture spread beneath its tracks. Blue light seeped upward. The snowmobile jerked sideways, losing traction, slipping toward the depression forming along the plateau's edge. The driver panicked, spinning the wheels, but Kale saw the mistake instantly. The wheels weren't spinning. They were being pulled. The snowmobile slid silently toward the sinking frost. The driver yanked the door open and leapt out, rolling across the hard snow. The machine slid faster, sliding as though drawn by a magnet. It reached the brink, paused, tilted, and sank. Gone in seconds. The plateau took it. Kyle stepped back further from the ridge, instinct pushing him away from the irresistible pull forming below. The silence grew heavier, as if compressing the air around him, thickening it. He opened his mouth and hissed with all the force his lungs could muster. No sound came out, not even inside his own skull. He felt his throat vibrate, but nothing escaped. The silence had grown strong enough to devour the sound before it touched the air. Kyle's heart hammered harder. He looked at the trees around him. Branches cracked and bent, but not a single snap was heard. Snow slid from pine needles in soft arcs, drawn toward the hollowing plateau like tiny comets pulled toward a gravitational well. The frost on the plateau finally broke. Not explosively, quietly, of course, but completely. Large sheets of frost split apart, sliding inward. Beneath them, Kale saw more of the impossible glow. Not bright enough to blind, but bright enough to reveal depth. Endless, cavernous depth, like the plateau was only a thin roof over a tremendous void. And that void was expanding. Kale's breath quickened. The hares behind him bolted again, moving far up the ridge. The wolverine trotted after them, shoulders low. Birds erupted from the treetops in complete silence, wings flapping furiously. They flew not upward, but sideways, avoiding the patches of air being sucked downward toward the plateau. Kale prepared to run. But then the light pulsed again, a deep, heavy throb of brightness. And for the first time Kale understood that the plateau wasn't simply collapsing. It was being peeled open, slowly, methodically, by pressure rising from below. Something beneath the ice wanted space. The humans finally fled in their trucks and snowmobiles, engines silent, headlights flickering across the frost as they vanished behind distant ridges. Their departure left Kale alone with the sinking plane and the unnatural glow leaking through the widening fissures. The silence shifted. It wasn't suction anymore. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't the simple absence of sound. It was resonance, matching something rising from below. Kyle's whiskers trembled. The fur along his spine rose. The ridgeline under him thrummed faintly in time with the pulses of light. The plateau inhaled one last time. A massive, slow pull that dragged snow, frost shards, pine needles, dust, and even small stones toward its center. Kyle dug his claws deep, leaning backward, anchoring himself. The plateau exhaled, and the thin crust finally gave way. A huge slab of frost collapsed inward, revealing a yawning pit beneath. Not black, not empty, a hollow with walls of cracked stone glowing faintly with pale light. Cold air rushed upward, carrying the smell of something old, something buried for centuries, something that had waited long enough. Cale stared wide-eyed, breath frozen in his throat. Whatever lay beneath the frost-bound plateau was awake now, and the silence that dominated the land was its first sign of life.